Welcome to episode 44. Reflections on the sixth-year curriculum, creative credentialing, and the Continuum College in a post-COVID-19 world, tapping the brain of none other than Rovy Branon. This is a story of a wannabe rock star who turned in his guitar, but not his long hair, he can show us right now, for a journey west. A journey west from North Carolina, northwest to Indiana, northwest to Wisconsin, and northwest further to Washington. It likely should have been titled The Westward Expansion of the Mind of Rovy Branon, or The Big Red Impact of Non-Traditional Lifelong Learning, because he's been at Big Red, Indiana, Big Red, Wisconsin, and Big Red, University of Wisconsin. Instead of strumming a guitar, his fingers were into things like creating the first competency-based program offered by the University of Wisconsin system, and spearheading a patented mobile learning platform. Upon graduation from Indiana, Rovy went to Wisconsin and served as associate dean right away. I mean, I can't believe it. And CTO and executive director of the Advanced Distributed Learning Lab, the ADL lab in Wisconsin, the academic collab. But since 2014, he's been at the University of Washington, and he got them to change its name from extension and outreach and all that kind of stuff to the Continuum College, where they now have 55,000 learners through 110 master's degrees and 100 certificates. In his spare time, he's president of the University Professional and Continuing Education Association, USPCA. Well, there's a lot of things. That's enough of Rovy Branon for a second. Doesn't need me anymore. I'll let Rovy talk a little bit about himself. But it's a pleasure to have him back. He's a former student of mine at Indiana, and it's great to see so much success in such a short amount of time. And he is going to impress you, believe me. Rovy.
Kurt, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, this afternoon, morning, day, whatever time it is where you are in the world. Great to see you. I'm going to play that opening every morning when I get up in the morning while I'm eating my breakfast. So thank you for that. Kurt gets me pretty excited there. Bigger send-off than I typically think of for myself. So, I will say, the mentor and the mentee. So we've got the long hair. Kurt's trying to grow it out, but I think I'm still a little bit in the lead here. So, but I think that's what you get when you get people that think a little bit differently about the world and a little bit differently about life. As Kurt said, I'm
muted. I'd say I'm really trying hard.
And it's great to be here. I'm very excited about it. As Kurt said, I'm the vice provost for what we call Continuum College at the University of Washington in Seattle. And if you don't know much about the University of Washington, we are the Huskies. And as you can see, I have my, even though Kurt highlighted all the schools that have red that I have attended, I am in a purple school now. So excited to be in my UW purple this morning. The University of Washington serves about 48,000 undergraduates and graduates each year on primary campus. Our unit, Continuum College, serves about an additional 55,000 learners a year, as Kurt mentioned, through about 400 different kinds of programs that we run. We are one of a handful of units, I think, around the world, maybe 20 or 30 or so at major research universities that are this comprehensive and this substantial. We are probably one of the larger of those kinds of units that focus on extending education. A lot of that does come from the era of Wisconsin and even Harvard way back in the day, thinking about extending beyond just the elite research focus of most institutions and taking, as Charles Van Hise said in Wisconsin, the borders of the campus from the edge of campus to the edge of the state. And of course, today we think of that not just in terms of the state of Washington, but we think of it in terms of our region here in the Pacific Northwest, the United States, and indeed a global perspective as we look forward. It is an exciting role to be in today because the world of higher education is changing pretty dramatically. And units like ours have traditionally served what we might call the non-traditional learners or adult and continuing learners. And while there's still a lot of truth to that, the reality is, at least here in the United States, most learners are now non-traditional learners. And depending on what criteria you use, that could be as much as 74% of the college-going population in the United States has at least one characteristic that would qualify them to be a non-traditional learner. So we now call this the new traditional learner versus the non-traditional learner, because it is more common to be over the age of 24 and in college today than it is to be between 18 and 22. And so as we look at this world that's emerging, that it's changing, it's great. We love to see higher education being more democratized through the way that we are opening the doors for people across the lifespan. Kurt mentioned, I played, I was a drummer. I played a little bit of everything, but I was a drummer in a rock band for a while. But part of my history was the fact that I was told by a high school counselor that I was not college material. I shouldn't think about going to college. I didn't have the grades for it. That sounds really terrible when you think about somebody telling you that, but in all fairness to my high school counselor, I probably wasn't a very serious student at the time and probably wasn't quite ready to go in. So I started my own business. I played music at night, managed my band, and years later, a community college tricked me in Charlotte, North Carolina. They offered free time for your band to come in and do a recording in a recording studio as a part of a non-credit certificate in audio engineering. And so all the musicians knew about this. It was the cheapest way to get a demo tape done for your band. So I signed up. Now, part of what happened was they didn't tell you that you had to do real math and real work as a part of an engineering certificate. And so you had to do all of the engineering work before you could get into the studio. Well, I discovered I could actually be a pretty serious student when I had the proper motivation, and I sailed right through. I could do very high level math, which was a shock to everyone, especially my high school teachers and my mother. But that set me on a path. And I was in my mid-20s. My son was born while I was in college. I was working full-time and taking a full load of undergraduate classes. And so I have a really deep appreciation for the majority of college goers today who have experiences that are a little bit more like this than the traditional undergraduate experience that we see as so common. So I have a real passion for thinking about lifetime learning. And I do believe that all of us have the ability to pick up and continue learning, and we all have to keep learning in this environment. Chris, do you have a question? I'll stop there for a moment. No, okay. I may be a little bit.
I'll ask. That was to Kurt really more than to you.
Okay, sure.
It was sort of getting my place in line when you're through giving the intro.
Got it. So anyway, as a part of my background and a part of where I am now, Kurt talked a little bit about my journey across the country. At the University of Washington, we have about 220 employees in the unit that we run, again, serving about 55,000 learners with about 350 to 400 different kinds of programs. Those programs span from summer youth camps, 8-year-olds. We have what we call an Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And we have a 98-year-old in that program, and the average age is 75 in our Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. So we have 8-year-olds to 98-year-olds. We also run UW in the high schools for high school students. We run early fall start for our incoming freshmen who need a little boost. We run summer session on behalf of campus. And as Kurt said, we have about 110 master's degrees that we manage on behalf of our campus partners in professional areas primarily. And so when you look at that, you think, wow, you really have a lifespan of learning. And so that is really our focus, is this lifespan of learning across the continuum, if you will, and part of why our name is Continuum. And as we look at that, we begin to think, what does that mean in this era? So the term lifelong learning is not new. It's been around a very long time, but we like to think of what we have today as the 60-year curriculum. And so when we think about these programs, we think about lifelong learning, we think about what the average 18-year-old is going to need over their lifetime. And if you If you look at some of the literature on longevity, and I know we're in the midst of a pandemic, and so it's hard to think about extending life right now, but the trend line is toward 18-year-olds living up to 100 years, better than a 50-50 chance that your 18-year-old will live to be 100 and likely be healthy very late in life. The current economic conditions, according to Grattan and Scott in their wonderful book, Life and Law, the 100-year life, living in an age of longevity, they note that the economic conditions are such that our 18-year-olds will probably work into their mid-80s. So if baby boomers could stop in their 60s or 70s, Gen Xers like myself, probably going up into the low 70s. You see this cascading down as people live longer, as the economic conditions change. And so we begin to think of a 100-year life needing more of a 60-year curriculum versus a 4 or 6 or 8-year curriculum. We have a number of components to that. I'll talk about that as we get into our talk. We like to think about 5 key areas at the University of Washington: digital credentialing, new kinds of services for learners, what we call the meta curriculum, or how you think about programs versus a specific program, but a number of programs over a lifetime. We like to talk about the new academic stack of technologies that will be needed to connect people over the course of their lifetime. And of course, all of this has an underlying element of funding and policy that we're going to have to think about very, very deeply. So I'll stop there. I have a lot I could say about each of those areas, but let me let others get into the conversation and open it up for a few questions.
Now let's go to Chris right away, and take it away, Chris.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first is a little bit facetious, but do you have a high school guidance counseling certificate, and have you recommended it to your former high school guidance counselor?
We don't have that certificate in our purview, but again, I think I go back and forth between whether his advice was poorly given or whether maybe it was just the right thing I needed to hear. I'm not quite sure about that.
And so now a more serious question. Harvard, you're right, goes back a long way, as do some of the other universities. They were very farsighted in thinking about this. But what's happened in recent years, and you illustrate it with your statistics, is that the programs in continuing education now at these universities are much larger than the rest of the university. And there's a kind of tail starting to wag the dog phenomenon that's happening that is making a lot of my colleagues nervous, I would have to say. So do you experience the classical traditional academic side of the house kind of looking with trepidation at the fact that actually you're the one that's meeting the market demand much more than they are?
I think that is probably part of the history of continuing education going back a very long ways. I think every few decades we're accused of taking over the academy, often because we bring forward something new technologies that suddenly burst forward. And most recently, of course, many of our units pioneered distance education ahead of many of our universities and grew substantially. What happened during that era and over the last probably 15 years is we have seen some of those online units move out of continuing education and move to the center of universities. They almost got too big. But I think you're right. This is different because this really relates to the entire demographic profile of those who are choosing to go to college and when they're choosing to go to college. And that's very, very different. I think degrees are going to always be the cornerstone of our higher education profile. I think we're always going to have students in that age group who are going to need to go to college. I think the key element that we need to think about is not constraining ourselves to only thinking that that is the college experience as we move forward. And if we can think like that, I think a lot of the fear goes away at every step of the game, right? And it opens up new kinds of possibilities. So I was talking to our Dean of Arts and Sciences, and he was lamenting the move toward a much more professionalized view of education. As I think this is probably what you're alluding to a little bit, Chris, but thinking more in terms of job skills and focus on jobs, even at high levels, like a biomedical certificate is pretty high level skills. You're not going to get that at a community college, for example, but a focus on the professional versus on some of the things that might have been more traditionally within the realm of arts and sciences. And I said, here's what's interesting. I had my undergraduate experience. I was a psych major with a philosophy double major and a religious studies minor, even as an adult student. And I am so thankful that I had that kind of background to prepare me for the world that we're facing today. However, one of the things I said to this dean, I said, listen, at my age now, I would almost rather take my my courses in philosophy and religious studies now in my 50s, because I think I would have a very different perspective on all of that than I would have had in my 20s. Even though I was an adult learner, I think my perspective is so different. So again, and he kind of looked at me, I said, so it may not be the bachelor's degree for an 18-year-old, but could we think of a new kind of degree for people who are older and may really come back to these kinds of programs? And so we had a conversation about that. We weren't, as you would say, the faculty aren't quite ready to go there yet, but humanities faculty are already concerned, not because of the growth in continuing education, but because STEM education is really sucking all the oxygen out of the room for many of our humanities areas. So I think the 60-year curriculum is frightening, but it also offers incredible opportunities to think differently about our curricula and when we offer it and how we offer it. If it's across a lifetime, a lot more opportunity than just between 18 and 22, or maybe as a graduate degree. But yes, a lot of concern just over any entity on campus that gets really big and starts to grow really quickly. And I think it's worth having those conversations. I think they're important to have. We need to keep the essence of our institutions, the rigor of our academics has to be paramount, even in these more professional programs. And I think faculty are right to be wary and to keep their eyes open, right? And I think we try to include faculty. We have an advisory council of faculty. We let faculty review our materials. We stay very deeply engaged with faculty for that reason. But I do think you see around the edges some concerns.
Did you have a follow-up, Chris, that you wanted to ask? Okay, so Rovy, I'm gonna, in the spirit of reconciliation, where Biden's gonna have a win. You've faced many challenges in this role, I'm sure. Anybody does in an administrative role when they come into, to a huge university. And by the way, I forgot that UW is purple, but you went from one UW to another UW. And the one you were at, Wisconsin, was my alma mater, and they were involved in distance education to a huge degree, and why I ended up there, because I took distance learning classes in TV and correspondence at night to get into grad school. So I have a similar story to your story. But could you tell us of one success that you've had that was huge, and one success and a challenge that you haven't been successful for, but you hope to be? There's real hope for the future in this challenge or this barrier that you might be facing. And can you name a third barrier or challenge that you think you might not be so successful or might really take a long time? So give us one of each. One definite success, one you hope it's going to come, and one you're not so hopeful for. People might get a sense of how to do that.
Sure. I can think of a lot of ones I'm hopeful for that I wonder about. So I'll have to go. Let me put that one third, so I can sort of think through that just a little bit.
Yeah, you probably got a lot of number threes.
Yeah, there's a kind of a lot of things we'd like to be able to do that could be very, very difficult. I'm going to be pretty perfunctory here. I mean, so I came in. I followed. The person I followed had been in the role of vice provost for 30 years. And so whenever you follow someone who's been in their role for 30 years, it's a difficult transition, especially someone who's been very successful. And my predecessor, Dave Zatmary, who, by the way, a tidbit, he has one of the most well-used textbooks for the history of rock and roll. So it's he was kind of an interesting guy of his own right. whenever you follow somebody who's been in place for that long, people have a pretty set way. Everybody was hired under him, every single person, all the 200 people in the unit. There were very set ways of doing things. And so part of what we had to do is begin to change the mindset, right? And his focus was on program development, which is still important. That's a part of what we all have to do. I had a little bit more of a technology background. And so coming in to say, okay, we haven't had much tech background. We know that's an area we need to improve. And my marketing team was really excited and ready to go here. And so this is going to sound pretty tactical, pretty straightforward. But I said, let's revamp. At the time, we were managing 14,000 static web pages. So we had grown, but we had not processed with technology in a very effective way that growth. They were all flat files. They all had to be updated manually. We were 3 months behind in any web updates for our campus partners. For those many hundreds of programs, changes to the website were taking 2 to 3 months. And I said, we'd have to change. You know, I know we like our by hand process, everything gets checked, but that's just not acceptable service to the campus. So our marketing director said, well, I've been wanting a new platform. So we spent the money, I authorized about $2 million. We overhauled our web platform. We actually partnered with a company that had never worked with higher ed before, but they had worked with Starbucks and Target and all of these major retailers with large online presence. And I said, I want our website to look like that, right? I want us to be more like in that vein than higher education. And so we built out the website, we got it done. We took all those 14,000 web pages, put them into a modern web system. Updates could happen instantly by just about anybody at that point. And so we went from the 3-month backlog to 0 backlog. So our campus partners were happy. But the main thing we do marketing for is to let students know about our programs so they can get into our programs and we can effectively communicate with them. So I would say that was a success, but it wasn't we weren't thinking down the line far enough in terms of that success, because part of what happened was the day we turned on this new website, before we had a link, you could sign up for a newsletter, we would get 2 to 3 signups a day. And the day the new site launched, we started to get 150 requests for information a day because the architecture was better. It had been designed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And so we had a different problem that we hadn't planned for, how to answer all of those requests for information. So we had to quickly stand up a new unit, get them up to speed to respond to students within a 24 to 48 hour period. That required extending and using a third-party company to help us be able to manage that in the short term and train our staff on effectively working with students. So that I think was a big success. It required a lot of change management, both in terms of internally with our team. We had to do a lot of explanation about why this kind of spend. But if you go to pce.uw.edu, you can take a look at that website. It's we still have partners. We have colleagues at other universities saying, "Oh my gosh, how have you done this?" And it's now about a 3.5, 4-year-old architecture, but it works really, really well.
Is that your Salesforce initiative, or is it a different entity that you're working on?
Salesforce is kind of baked into some of the analytics, but this was really prior to Salesforce. So that's I think one of the areas where technology is where we're continuing to push. It is one of those challenging areas too, so where we hope we'll be successful over time, but it's going to be challenging. Obviously, we are working with, we do have Salesforce as a tool that we use to track enrollments. We believe Salesforce is one of those pieces to the new academic technology stack that we need to connect with our students as students and not as silos of data, right? So we want a lifelong learning connection with our students, not a come for 2 years or 4 years, come for your certificate, and then you go into the alumni pool. We want to continue making contact with them through the rest of their lives. So that's one it's in progress. We've got the front end of that sort of built, but we're still building that out. So I'm hopeful that that's going to continue. I think it is going to continue in terms of where we're going. I think when we, back to maybe Chris's earlier point, I think that there's a real door that's starting to open, and we'll see how far it gets, but I'm not sure how far we will go. And that is beginning to really think about our institution as an instrument of lifelong learning across everything that we do versus just our unit and the more traditional university. So I have some confidence that we'll see that happen. It may not be in my career lifespan, but I have a little less. So I'm a little less positive that I'll see that happen in my time. But I do think it is going to happen. I think that's where we're going to see our university start to move.
Shungi, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, Roy, I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm very curious. And at the same time, Young also have this question: are there any big changes in enrollment due to COVID? And also, how would the COVID affect the student demand and also your program change? Yeah.
Yeah, great question. What a year it has been for all of us. And one of the things I say quite often, and whenever I'm talking publicly, part of the perspective I think we should all have is that future generations are going to look back on these years with great awe and wonder how we made it through, just as we do at moments in history. And it's hard to have that perspective while we're in the midst of this. And I think that's going to be true for our universities as well as for greater society as well. We've been very fortunate at the University of Washington. Of course, in the United States, Seattle was really the first hotspot for COVID, and our university was the first major US university to shut down. I was in the president's cabinet meeting. Nobody else had made this call yet. We were very concerned whether it was the right thing to do. Obviously, politically, it was going to be a very difficult call to make. And our president said it's the right thing for our students. In Seattle, the global flu study is actually based in Seattle with our medical school. And they already knew COVID was here because they were tracking, the flu study was tracking every single strain of the flu for 2 years. And they saw people getting sick and dying, and they knew it wasn't the flu, and they knew COVID was already here. So we had advanced warning. We had some advance notice, but our president took that into account. She made the decision based on the best scientific data in our environment, and it was absolutely the right decision. By the end of the weekend, multiple universities had closed around the country. I got kudos or thanks from some of my colleagues saying, you gave us air cover, thank your president, we were able to close. So it was a bold moment for us. We were able to move in about 2.5 weeks out of, I think, 7,400 courses, 7,200 were able to be offered remotely in the spring, and we lost almost no enrollments, very few enrollments lost in the spring. Summer quarter, which my part of the university runs, saw a 30% increase in enrollments over the summer as we moved to full remote, and it was a record summer quarter of enrollments for us. And at a time where we need revenue, that was obviously a very, very important revenue marker, but it also helped a lot of students who might have been falling behind after spring quarter. Fall, we are about, we saw a little dip in applications, but we're actually up 1%. We've been growing much faster than that in previous years, so we're not seeing a major reduction. Now, in the professional programs that we offer in Continuum College, some of those have gone down in the fall, but they're recovering very, very quickly now that the economy looks like it may be starting to come back. So the shorter programs, where with the amount of uncertainty, we did see a lot of adult students say, we're just going to pull back and maybe wait a quarter, wait half a year, because these are not multi-year commitments. They're usually multi-month commitments. So we did see some of those programs reduce, but again, most of those went online. And the good news for us is what we've discovered are new audiences, I think, for many of our programs. So I know that's not true all over the country. We have about 10% of our courses at the University of Washington that are being conducted in person. These are generally lab classes or clinical classes, and they've been put in giant classrooms with maybe 50 students, but the classroom is designed for 600 or 700. So we are doing some safe things on campus, some limited safe things, but so far so good. I mean, we're really impressed with our students. They've done really well at following social distancing and masking guidelines. Like every university who has had some openings, we've had a few outbreaks here and there, but they've been very tightly managed. So we're cautiously optimistic for the future.
But you kind of have a campus where people can spread out a little better, unlike an more urban setting. Even though you're near downtown Seattle, you can walk around and find spaces and places to social distance. And it's not freezing cold like it is in Indiana. And also, people who are watching on YouTube, University of Washington is providing data for the world in terms of COVID, and they're doing a service that's, a wealth of good for the world community. So thank you for that. Chris has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say one little additional brag point for UW is the IMHE study that you see on so many Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. You see now on the news across the country. It was the only model last summer to correctly project and predict the winter surge. And so it has now become one of the more trusted models for that. But we got a chance to have a one-on-one with the head of that study just recently. I think back in back in early January, we heard there was going to be a sharp drop starting at the end of January, end of February in the United States, and nobody could believe it. And now if you start to see that data, you're starting to see that peak and maybe starting to see it drop. So again, they do a great job over there, and we're just proud to have them as a part of our institution.
Wow, what a catch. Wow. Yeah. Chris.
So I'm going to continue this theme of sort of continuing lifelong education and higher education. Some relatively elite universities have published reports talking not so much about the future of the field, but their future. So Stanford 2025 talks about sort of looping university education, where you might graduate at age 22, but you have sort of a 2-year credit that you can come back and use. And of course, we know that when older and more experienced people enter classes with undergraduates, it's a huge win all the way around. I mean, they're wonderful mentors and role models. They get to build on the excitement and the creativity of young people. The faculty have, rich opportunity for dialogues. Georgia Tech has its lifetime education model, declaring a passion rather than a major, thinking of yourself as a suite of skills rather than a role, having human libraries scattered around the world as opposed to digital libraries based on print scattered around the world. A lot of creative ideas that actually, I think, reflect, as you said earlier, innovations from continuing lifelong learning that sort of flow back into standard academics. So do you think it's possible that we'll see at least one university that goes into sort of a fusion where there isn't a distinction between continuing and higher education, because everybody's sort of mixed together in a model that has looping and passion-based learning and so on?
I think we will. I think we're going to see it. I don't know that there will be a switch that will flip and we suddenly see a university in that mode. I think we are tinkering around the edges of that space at the University of Washington, maybe not as comprehensively, I think, is what you're describing for the future, but I think it is part of the conversation we're starting to have because of how deeply integrated we already are with the rest of our university. Even though we're called a college, all of those master's degrees that run through us are offered by the schools and colleges on our campus, so they're not unique to us, they're in the academic units. So we are already deeply integrated. And part of what's happening is we used to be the folks people would go to get a degree off the ground if they didn't have state money. They're self-sustaining. That's part of what we help to do. But now what's happening is in the last 2 years, and this is what our team is really moving toward, is they're beginning to ask us to think about entire portfolios of how they operate. They're not necessarily using the words of lifetime or lifespan learning, but that's in essence what they're starting to move toward. It's not just let's offer a single master's degree that hits this audience or a bachelor's degree that hits that audience, but what is a portfolio of offerings that we might have across the lifespan? So we see a little bit of that happening here. I will say, I think your initial comment about older people on college campuses, it's really interesting to watch a lot of the experiments going on at Arizona State University right now. They are doing a lot in online learning, obviously, and so that gets a lot of attention because of their growth in online learning, and I think that's a big part of the strategy to reach more students. But they also have, in the last few years, partnered with a company that works globally to do senior housing. And they have put, Mirabella is the name of the company, and they have put senior housing in the middle of campus. And they're calling it a senior dorm. And it's quite expensive, actually. But if you can afford to live there in a quite nice retirement community, you get full student privileges. You get a meal card. You can drop in and audit any classes, and you get free access to any of the student art shows and fairs. And I think it's exactly what you're talking about, Chris, is that excitement, that energy. I think and for me, I think this is important because we think a lot about making sure our universities are really good about helping students understand new cultures. I think as we have students now leaving our universities, even at 23, 24, they're going to enter workforces with people who are 65, 68, 70, working side by side with them, not as their managers and leaders, but potentially working with them. And as universities, I think we need to begin to prepare people for the day when it's not just the person at the front of the classroom who's much older, but the person sitting next to them who may be a colleague and they're learning. And so we see a few universities experimenting in these spaces where we're beginning to see this kind of synergy and energy that can come from mixing across generational cultures as well as other forms of culture. So I hope we'll see more of that. We're early in that phase here. Our Osher Institute today brings faculty to senior centers and they give lectures, but it's not as deep as an integration of having as it would be to have those folks living on campus, potentially interacting with our students. And I think we will see a few of those experiments, and that might lead to that fusion that you're talking about, that true blend. I know of a couple of other universities that are thinking about this far more intentionally, especially research universities. We might see it more in the teaching universities first in some places. And I think we already do have some that really have good examples of that today. But in terms of research universities, I think we're going to grow into that. And it will be unique as each of us are, and probably done in ways that are different and specific to our communities that we serve.
Before Shungi jumps in here, Rovy, are you seeing any spikes in particular areas, particularly certificates? Because you talk about high value non-credit courses. What are those? What have those become in this COVID age? And also what do you anticipate that the spikes to be in the near future? What areas are you ramping up courses now to address your future needs? And what current ones did you get unexpected boost? And you said, oh, we have to offer more sections of it. I'm just curious, especially since you're a big tech center. I imagine in Seattle, there's certain areas that are more of a focus than others.
Well, you're right. For us, I think here in Seattle, and I think one of the things that's interesting that to note is we're a little bit interesting in the fact that we're the only research university in the Seattle region. And so unlike if you're in the Northeast, you've got a lot of competition there. If you're Harvard in California, in the Bay Area, you have 4 or 5 major research universities. We're it here. So we serve a really wide variety of needs. And that's one reason we have such a large offering for continuing education. Tech is top for us. Folks in the tech industry have to continuously retool, so that also helps us. We have certificates in all kinds of programming languages. What we see right now is really hot adjacencies that help people move into other spaces are really key. So project management is always a top seller for us. And that lets you, if you're a techie, maybe move into the next phase of your career if you don't want to continue coding, but it also enables you to move into the tech space if you might be on the outside of that, and project management is a way in. We're seeing a lot of growth in any program, and we have 21 different programs, certificates and degrees with the word data in the title. Data science, data engineering, data visualization. We have short programs, we have certificates, we have master's degrees, we have a new undergraduate minor that's emerging at our university in this area. So these are very hot areas too. Again, they're nice adjacent areas for either people trying to move into a more tech-oriented space in Seattle, or tech folks looking to broaden their skills so they can begin to grow and move forward. Business and entrepreneurship has been really hot here. It always is. So it's also about the startup culture. We have great startup folks that teach those programs, and people actually build their business plans. And we've had a number of companies actually launch out of that. And so those stay really popular. You know, during the pandemic, they've done pretty well. We've maintained pretty well in most of those spaces. We have a few surprises in the non-credit space, I would say. We've had a lot of people take creative writing. We've had a lot of people do more of the enrichment kinds of things in addition to their career. So memoir writing has been a very hot topic. We have a great memoir writing program. A lot of publications come out of that. So it doesn't necessarily lead to a job, but it leads to a much richer kind of life. And I think that's also an important part. We may have seen a little bit more of that sort of introspection in terms of the program selection than professional selection. That's beginning to shift. I think as jobs are starting to come back, companies are beginning to rehire. People are saying, how do I get myself ready now to come back after the pandemic or make a switch coming out of the pandemic? And so we're seeing more calls, the calls to our call center that are beginning to increasingly be about our professional programs, things like project management, business, and the like. So not too much of a change during the pandemic. I will tell you, not in the non-credit space, but for our summer quarter, faculty in the humanities and in languages never have really thought too much about online as being a possibility for them. And we have a course in Urdu, which is a very unique subset of language, and it normally gets about 4 or 5 students a year. And this summer it had 30 because you could enroll from around the world. And so people's eyes, I think, are opening up to these new modalities. And as I like to say, and I used to give a talk when I talk about the internet and technology and higher education, there are the programs like those at Georgia Tech, the master's degree that can now serve 10,000 students at very low cost. But the internet has always been about the big hits and the long tail. And I think in recent years, we've forgotten about the long tail possibility of using online. It's not about having 10,000 people, but it might be having 30 from around the world that lets a course actually be viable in a very unique and specialized area. So I think we're seeing faculty begin to understand, hey, my area that might barely make every quarter, I could, maybe if I begin to have an online section or an online component, that course could make every quarter instead. So I think we're going to see new thinking in that way too, but it's in unique spaces and really interesting courses, both in the non-credit and the credit space. I think the pandemic's just been an interesting time to see what people are wanting to learn about.
Interesting, very interesting. Xiangye has something, and Chris has a follow-up after that. Xiangye.
Very interesting. And my question is, are those MOOC platforms, if they are your competitors? Because now we can see quite a lot of these free learning materials online, and just like what you mentioned about memoir writing, that's very interesting field or a course, but usually maybe they could learn online or even from YouTube. So why do you see this kind of interest or this demand to enroll in a program at a university continuum school rather than learning from those free online platform? Yeah.
Well, that is a tremendous question that we have constantly thinking about. I think earlier, both Chris and Kurt talking about the market, and we think about the market maybe a little bit more than the institution does. So we watch these competitors. Now, I think we're in a world today where there are very few true competitors anymore. So there's co-opetition, right? So we're cooperating and we're in competition at the same time. And you can see this in the tech world. Apple buys their screens from Samsung, but competes with Samsung on their phone systems. We are partners with edX, and we're partners with Coursera, and we have our own open edX that we run internally for scaled programs. But they may also compete with some of our programs in some ways, for sure, because they're lower cost. Our mantra, our belief at Continuum College is that everyone deserves the education to thrive in an ever-changing world. And our mission, the way we accomplish that is we like to say we provide relevant education to each learner at the right time in their lives through the right mechanism, right? So for some people, a MOOC may be their only option or the most desired option. It's interesting here in Seattle, one of the things we hear from folks in the tech industry is, thank goodness I have a face-to-face option. I don't want to learn my computer language on the computer. I'm sitting behind the computer all night. I want a social experience for learning. And so we want to make sure we have different options for different people in different spaces. So our Career Accelerator program, and you can see this on our pce.uw.edu website. If you look at our certificates, we have what we call Career Accelerators. This was an experiment I launched about 4 years ago to offer our most in-demand certificates in 4 different distinct formats. One of those we call on-demand, and that's really a MOOC format. But we have a 9-month part-time, 1 night a week. That most of our certificates are in that vein, face-to-face, 1 night a week, 9 months. We have a second model that's half that time, so go 2 nights a week and get it done in about 4.5 months now. Then we have online through Canvas, which is structured like a traditional quarter-based online program, and we have on Open edX a MOOC-like version of these same certificates. Now, they don't run like MOOCs. They have more instructor interaction than a traditional MOOC, but we have all of those pieces, and we see different learners selecting different modalities based on where they live, but also based on what they want to get out of learning and the kind of experience that they want. So what we see is providing lots of choice and lots of opportunity to experience a MOOC, but we know a lot of people always want that human connection. And so for me, I think it's a landscape that I hope will open the door to far more people through MOOCs and other things than we can do with face-to-face. But on the other hand, I think we have broad enough audiences and enough needs across society that multiple modalities are really going to be needed to meet everybody where they are. And we see that happening. So we participate in providing MOOCs. We see some competition from that, but mostly we think that by staying ahead of the game, we're going to stay ahead of any potential competition.
I put a couple of links in the YouTube channel for Rovy wrote articles for the evolution on MOOCs, and I'll put them here in the chat window as well. He also was interviewed in the evolution, and Chris has written in the evolution on the 6th-year curriculum. So it's a place that you might want to go to, evolution with 3 L's to it, and it's free. Chris, go ahead.
So I want to talk about admissions and some of the really interesting things that are happening there. As you know, Harvard has very, very selective admissions for its classic academic programs. On the other hand, the Division of Continuing Education is open admission. If you can do the work, you can get the degree. And there's no filter in terms of being able to try. And now we see sort of blended approaches coming. So I know that for some of the MicroMasters at MIT, you do the first half in MOOC. And then if you do well enough, you're invited to actually enter the degree program and do the second half through the classic campus thing. I'm waiting for the big data studies that show that by and large, the admissions process is not very good at identifying talent. You know, these high stakes tests actually are what artificial intelligence does well on. So what we're doing is we're training and selecting students to lose to AI in the workplace, as opposed to emphasizing the human side, which is what the Dean of Liberal Arts would be saying, I'm sure, in your conversation with him. Do you have any thoughts about how we're going to disentangle this issue of admissions and talent with all these different models emerging, but you know, the traditional model of saying, no, it's all about grades, it's all about high test scores, that's your talent mechanism?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I think many of us, I don't know about at Harvard, but I know we are experiencing a lot of angst around this issue just related to coronavirus and how we're going to think about what high school grades look like, knowing that the experience is just so different than the experience these students have had. Will many of them be far behind despite their grades? Will their grades reflect maybe where they are and put them at a disadvantage that they might not have been in before? We, like many places, are dropping standardized testing as an admissions criteria that was initially just for the pandemic, but that's now going to be made permanent. Just yesterday, I was in an intense conversation about what we're going to do about English language testing as we move forward. That's a critical component of what we do, but it's also seen as a barrier for a lot of students, for not just in terms of the test and the outcomes and having to take additional, perhaps remedial or supplemental courses in English, but also just simply the price of paying for those remedial courses, paying for the examinations, put additional pressures on those students, making it even harder for them to be successful and potentially stay in school. I think that you know, there's always the question of whether universities like Harvard, universities like Washington, others that are selective in their admissions approach, whether we do better at education or better at selection of students, right? I think that's always a question for all of us. But I think that is starting to change. And so again, the pandemic is going to, I think, have a role in shifting those attitudes here. You know, we live in a world in the United States, especially, let's just look at where we are, where about 32% of our population has a bachelor's degree and 70% does not. And I said this to a faculty group, and it gave me some really strange looks. I said, look, we're educating what is now 26% of college going students are traditional in all of the facets. And we're only educating roughly 30% of the country with bachelor's degrees. So we really are educating the minority of the minority at many of our research institutions. And we're losing potentially the richness of diversity in society as we think of it in that way. I do think we're going to be challenged to rethink about that. There are two things here. There are true physical and fiscal constraints to what we can do and serve, right? So we have to acknowledge that no matter how good we are, there's going to be some limit to that. I'd love it if our state legislature just really opened up the piggy bank and said, you know what, let's just go back to the golden era and even accelerate that golden era where we were 40 or 50% of your underlying base. And then let's open the door to many, many more students. So I think part of what you're getting at, the admissions process is in part a gate because we don't have the resources to serve everybody that would love to come to our institutions. The other issue that we have in admissions right now, of course, is that many smaller institutions are failing, but not institutions that are large in many cases. So our application rates are going up. I don't know about Harvard's, but they're probably going up as well. And so you see students with this sort of, as former Dean Hunt Lambert at Harvard used to say, it was a flight to quality brands, right? Where students are not sure right now. The uncertainty is saying, hey, I know those schools are going to remain financially solvent. I know they're going to be good. And that puts additional strain on the admissions process to weed out even more. So I think it's going to have to change. I think we are already seeing different ways that we think about admissions at the University of Washington. I still think, there's an AI issue even about admissions, right? We have people that read every single application that come into our university. That warms my heart, right, as a human being. But we get 48,000 applications. And so it's thousands of readers that we employ, and they're doing it individually. They're thinking about these things in unique ways. Yes, we end up with wonderful students at our institution, but our admissions folks realize the world is changing very rapidly. I think the tension isn't so much between us and main campus right now, at least at our university in terms of the approach, but it is this societal question of, can we afford to continue to keep as many really talented people out? I asked my admissions director, and I'll stop here. I asked my admissions, our senior VP of admissions, this question several years ago. 45,000 applications, we accept about half, and then the yield is about, maybe we have about 7,000 incoming freshmen each year at the University of Washington, very large incoming freshman class. But still a very small percentage of students in the total pool of that 44,000 that are applying. And I said, out of that larger pool, how many do you think could be successful at the University of Washington? And I thought maybe he'd say a margin of about another 10%. And he said probably about 98% of the additional applicants would be good enough to be successful at the University of Washington, and we have to turn them away. And that, they end up in great places in most cases, but that's just showing you the magnitude of the possible talent that doesn't get to take advantage of universities like us. And I don't think society is going to stand for that for much longer. I think the publics are going to be under increasing pressure faster, but you all are feeling a lot of that populist pressure too at Harvard. And I think we're going to have to find ways to serve more people with the kind of rigor and quality that we have if we're going to be successful.
Yeah.
Shungi has a couple of things. Go ahead, Shungi.
Yeah, I got a kind of almost toward the end of the show. I would still ask how would you see after pandemic, how much is our diploma or degree? How would those matter after in the post-pandemic, and how would you see where the higher education would be going? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, I think once again, during the pandemic, we're seeing the tremendous value and equity of having a college degree. Folks with a college degree in large measure, especially here in the United States, have been able to work from home. They have many of the white collar jobs, they have fared better, they have better health outcomes. We also know there are racial issues here in the United States that have played into the overall COVID situation as well. So I think there will be There will be maybe a temporary pullback on adult students who are just concerned about the overall environment, the approachability. But I think the value of a college degree is going to continue to increase as long as we have this artificially constrained number of people that can obtain a college education. And we think that's going to continue. I think there's going to be a lot of differences in the way those degrees are offered. I think we are going to see more flexibility. As I mentioned earlier, we have faculty now very interested in thinking about how they might expand what they do. And so that's going to maybe create more opportunities for these degrees as we move forward. But I think the future is, I think we're going to see people really looking at what happened during this pandemic, looking at those people who had education. I think as we look back retrospectively, we're going to see the impact of those with education versus those who did not have education. Again, race, economics, all the other lines also matter there, but I think that's going to raise the bar for degrees going forward.
A couple of things, Rovy. I think you addressed both of these. We talked on the phone a week or two ago, and you said, you know what I want to talk about at some point in the show is what the University of Washington is planning for the future. In particular, they're rethinking online learning. It sounded like you gave me the nudge in a huge way. So would you like to discuss some of the University of Washington's plan for next year or the year after in terms of online learning? Because it has ramifications for all institutions, higher ed, K-12, corporate. Washington's leading the way. They'll lead the way again. And then I have a similar question on UPCEA, but answer the first one and we'll see if we have time for the second one.
Yeah, I think we've already talked a little bit. I think we're going to see, we are a very faculty-centric institution, so we have very heavy faculty governance here, and I think that's part of what makes us so special. But that also means we have a very decentralized model of operating when we think about things like online learning. But however, as that instead of a push, and for those of us who are excited about online, we're always evangelizing. Now there's a pull that's starting to come. I think what we're starting to see, and what we've all been struggling with during the pandemic, is we're beginning to realize there are not enough instructional designers in the world to serve us. I did a back of the envelope with my VP of Academic Affairs when we were thinking about this, and here's one of the things that's going to change. We have to think differently about how we are able to resource our institutions for instructional design. I said, a traditional online program today, we put a tremendous amount of instructional design and production time into it. It's a formal online course. And I said, let's assume that every online course needs that much help in order to be good. Over 7,000 courses, did the back of the envelope math by the number of designers we tend to put on a course when it's truly online. And we would need 536 instructional designers at the University of Washington to have the same quality of support across our entire portfolio. So I think that's going to change. And so part of what we're talking about is how do we have, at a decentralized university, how do we have a network of designers, production folks that aren't centralized in one big unit? And some universities do that really well. But for those of us that are decentralized, how do we have many pieces loosely joined that can work together and support each other? That has happened during this pandemic. So my team has been supporting the small central campus technology team, but they've been invisible. I had a faculty say, what have you all been doing during the pandemic? I said, well, we've been providing all of that online support that looks like it's coming from the central office, but it's actually my team providing a lot of those webinars and support. So I think we're going to see these decentralized pieces working to support our entire institution going forward. We're still going to have separate online, but I think online is just going to be another modality versus so special. It's just going to be a different kind of classroom in the future. And that's the way we're thinking about it at the University of Washington today.
So the UPCEA, have they had similar discussions? Well, as a final comment, since you're the president, volunteer president, what are you volunteering? What you're for a lot of colleges in that organization. Have you heard similar things or different things?
I think everybody's thinking about it in a very different way. So some universities have a much larger central online presence, and so they're going to work forward from the strengths that they have, I think, in those spaces. Others have a smaller demand than what we're seeing at the University of Washington, so they're approaching it in very different ways. UPCEA, for those who don't know, University Professional and Continuing Education Association, it really does focus on continuing and online education. And in fact, this next week we have a conference called Solar that's coming up, Summit for Online Leadership and Roundtable. And the Roundtable was this last week. I think across the country, around the world, what we're hearing from our colleagues, of course, everybody is in a state of flux right now. But I think what we're beginning to hear is what I've been saying too, which is, oh, people are waking up to the possibility. I like to say, I think we've taken a lot of folks from maybe a first grade understanding of digital learning to at least a sixth grade understanding of digital learning on our campuses almost overnight, right? I mean, it's almost like World War II in terms of how quickly we brought a number of people up to read at the beginning of that war when they were brought into the fight, right? Because you had to. And now you're getting people who are going to be very hungry, I think, to take that next step. We're getting that across all of our members, right? We can't get enough instructional design support. We can't get enough support for our faculty. But on the other hand, I think we hear an embracing of what might look different and how it might look different. So I think that's part of what's really exciting. It's been a great association to have these conversations. As an association in continuing education, and this being my year to be president, who would have known? I thought I'd be, doing the perfunctory sorts of things. We had to save our association first. We have pivoted. We've offered tremendous value in online conferences that I think have been really well put together. And again, as an association, we're rethinking as an entire association. Yes, we still want annual conferences, but we could bring together people far more often if we use these digital tools more effectively going forward. So I think both for our membership at UPCEA, but also for what's happening at our member institutions, a spirit of experimentation, a spirit of trying things that are new and different. Excited to be headed toward the future with that.
And we're excited to have you, Rovy. And, you got us thinking about the 6-year curriculum. And so I'm eating a lot of fruits and vegetables to make sure I'm available, decades from now to take your classes.
Well, I got to say, you got to go. Everybody's got to go with Chris and John Richards' book, right? The 60-year curriculum. That's I want to make sure to get a good plug in for that, because a lot of colleagues have written great and deep stuff in that book. So make sure to go get that book. Search for DD and 60-year curriculum. You're going to find it pretty quickly.
Well, Chris is going to have the last comment here in a second, but next week we'll have a host reflection. So come next week and hear the host reflect on the last 4 shows. But it's a real pleasure to have someone who took me back to think about being a 6th grader again and to think about my future decades from now. And so it's wonderful to see an alum of our program make a huge impact around the world. And thank you, Rovy. Chris, final comment.
Yeah, Rovy, we just really want to thank you for making time for this. You truly are a leader in this area, and I and others have benefit every day from what you're doing. So please keep doing it. And you also have brought some valuable balance to our program. We have a lot of K-12 viewers. We think a lot about K-12, but we also have a lot of higher education viewers and continuing education viewers. And I think we maybe even need to do a show on workforce capacity building, because that's the topic that we didn't get to. That's the other big unmet need right now. So much to think about. Thank you, Rovy.